Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Liddell and I have changed my surname because I was blessed enough to get married last week. I'm a minister here in the United Reformed Church in Cardiff, where I currently serve in an ecumenical setting. Each week I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And today I am so pleased to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jasmine Devadason. Jasmine is currently working as a Learning and Development Officer for the North West Mann Region of the Methodist Church. She served as a tutor of Hebrew Bible at Southern Theological Education and Training Scheme, Sarum College, Salisbury, before she moved to Manchester. She worked for the Diocese of Manchester as a World Mission Officer and has been ordained by the Diocese of Manchester. Jasmine has completed her PhD at the University of Manchester on examining the Book of Job from a Dalit woman's perspective. Jasmine's academic interests focus on the Hebrew Bible, Dalit Feminist Liberation hermeneutics, and the post-colonial hermeneutics. So Jasmine, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Lee, and it's a privilege to be part of this talk. And congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. So Jasmine, politics in the pulpit, what does that mean for you? And do you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
That's a good question, because knowingly or unknowingly, or consciously or unconsciously, so the politics is part of my preaching, maybe because of the place where I come from, the caste system, which discriminates a group of people in the name of caste, and that itself is political, and the way that my background influences the way I preach, prepare a sermon. So I can't separate myself touching any of the political issues when I'm in the pulpit. At least for two reasons, because of my background is one of the reasons. And the second is the biblical texts are written when the people are living under different political power. Yeah. So their faith is always connected with the political context of their time. Yeah. And we have quite a lot of political language that is used even in the time of Jesus, like a rule. And when we pray as Jesus as Lord, and kingdom of God examples, and all those things reflect the political, the language used in that context. We use that language in order to give a radical or counter argument to the political context of Jesus's time or in the biblical times. So when we preach from those texts, and we can't separate faith and politics as a separate one. So we have to bring that aspect into our preaching. So if we are preaching kingdom of God, and you can't just miss out what is relevant for today's system, how it works, and what is relevant for that. Yeah. So I can't see anything as a separate one, but it is part of mine.
Yeah. We heard a bit in your introduction about your PhD and your context. So what from your context, whether that be now or further back, would you want us to hear as key justice issues or political events? I know you mentioned the caste system and the kind of growing up and the difficulties that, or what that meant for you in reality.
Yeah. So having come from the previous colonial nation in a colonized country, India. So the colonial impact is always there in my background, in my context. Yeah. And moving to this country as a migrant, so I always felt in my day-to-day life that I encounter my foreignness. So I'm not a white, and English is not my first language. So I'm not a male. So all those identities as a woman, so as an Asian woman, I carry so many different identities within me.
Yes.
So in terms of how I relate to the church context or everyday context, that my color and my identity, my language, my caste, all those things, I carry with me. And when I read the biblical text, always that has an influence the way I read the biblical text, but also how I relate and respond to the current situation. All my personal context reflects the way I react to the current issues.
Yeah. I remember when I was studying for my degree, and that was one of the real kind of eye-opening things for me, was how often we don't bring all this to how we read the Bible, that we leave all that out. But when you bring in your experiences and the many lenses of which we read the Bible through our experiences and who we are, and so the women is a lens, and your economic status, and all of these things just really open up the text in a really honest way of being able to encounter God. But equally, it's a difficult thing to do when preaching, because you don't want to bring all your lenses into the pulpit, because then we're merely just preaching through those, but equally we can't ignore them. And I think you highlight that really, really crucial point of bringing ourselves into this.
So I'm a person, one who always liked to kind of have a connection with, as a student of a Hebrew Bible. And I always wanted to make sure that the biblical text is connected well with the context where we live in.
Yeah.
So the context is very much important, but the traditional approaches might say that the biblical context is much important than to understand the biblical text better. But of course, it is important to understand the background so that we can be truthful to the text that is in front of us. But more important, how you connect with today's context, because we are, of course, distanced by more than 2,000 years, the gap between biblical text context and our context. But the smooth transition, but our context does influence the way we read the text, whether the liberation theologians or anyone who reads the Bible. Nobody reads Bible, unbiased.
No.
So we are biased in one or other sense, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So that means we have to be very careful what context and what things that we bring in when we make the text relevant to our context.
Yeah, absolutely. It's having that awareness. And my colleagues at JPIT have suggested some things that we might want to keep an eye on as we look at the readings for this week. So some of the key issues. It's, of course, Remembrance Sunday, this coming Sunday. And so that will obviously heavily influence our services and how we approach the lectionary readings. Next week is Interfaith Week and also Living Wage Week. And also we have some huge headlines going across the world as well. We have the COP27 climate conference, which started on Sunday. So lots of push for loss and damage funds to the nations that have been mostly affected by the climate crisis. We, of course, have the American midterm elections happening this week. And also, unsurprisingly, but still with heartache, the recession that is likely coming. And we will hear Jeremy Hunt's delayed autumn statement on the 17th. And so it is with all of this, our metaphorical newspapers, let's open our Bibles. So I wonder, Jasmine, if there is a particular passage or theme or question that jumped out for you this week from our readings that you'd like to start with.
Actually, you have covered so many, points of what we are going through in today's context. And there's so many incidents and so many events coming up, and so many of them are focused. But immediate my connection is with the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, the Old Testament passage, where we have a kind of Isaiah's vision of a peaceful kingdom.
Yeah.
And that could be the focus for all of those events that you are mentioned about, in either taking it as a Remembrance Sunday, or ecological crisis, or interfaith matters. In anything that you take, what we are aiming for is to have a peaceful kingdom. The vision that Isaiah portrays. So that's a kind of a good passage to focus on. Maybe it's not only connecting very well with the context where we live in, but also maybe personally, I am very much inclined to take Hebrew Bible as a preaching point, because most of the time preachers take gospel writings or New Testament as the main focus of preaching. But I tend to bring Hebrew Bible as a one of the preaching texts whenever I do preach. And that's more relevant at this point in this conversation to take Isaiah 65. Because it connects with the new heaven, new earth. So one of the things we start when we talk about new heaven, new earth is something, and the heaven is somewhere else that we meet after our death. New heaven is something, new heaven, new earth is to be waited for until you are dead. But what Isaiah is talking here is about realizing that new heaven, new earth in the world where we live in. And what needs to be done in order to realize that new heaven, new earth, the peaceful kingdom in this year. So I think when we go deeper into, then we may discover more on what type of participation we need to take in order to realize the peaceful kingdom that Isaiah is visioning.
Yeah. And I wonder, for I am about to create new heavens and new earth, that immediately kind of brings us back to, the story of the flood and, God leveling earth and starting again. But it's not that, is it, in this passage? It's not this kind of genesis again of a new heaven and a new earth. It's something different, isn't it?
Yes, it is something different. What we are seeing here is, it's in the context of humiliation of Jews during the time of Persian period, taking third part of Isaiah as a post-exilic kind of text. So thinking about Persian context, where the people, even though, so we may have a picture of Persian King Cyrus being a liberator and letting all the people to go back to their own land. But the other side of it, every colonizers have their own strategy to colonize, the nations. So the Babylonians took the people outside of their land as a captives, and that is their strategy. But for Persians, it is for them to give their own land back, but controlling them where they are. So the land, including the land being colonized. So that's where the ecological connection comes. So the new heaven, new earth, it's not only talking about rebuilding relationship between human beings, but it talks about relationship between nature as well, animal kingdom as well. So if you read, Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, when they return, so one of the points that they are making is, so we are slaves. Not only we are slaves, but also our animals being controlled by the Persian, the dominant group. So they were controlled, including the animal kingdom, being oppressed in that context, if you read Nehemiah there. So it's a context there they feel humiliated, oppressed, and they wanted to have some kind of freedom out of those oppression. So what the peaceful kingdom brings is no more pain, no more suffering. So it's not about totally altogether different way of another kingdom to dominate. It's not a worldly kingdom that another kingdom to dominate Persians, but it's rather upside down kingdom.
And it's really fascinating. The talk of the animals at the end, the lion shall eat straw like the ox. it's not saying the lion isn't going to be a predator, but what it is saying is that there is opportunity to live peacefully alongside each other and sharing, and that for me kind of lights up the whole of this vision, which is based on kind of lots and lots of contrasts, isn't it, as we go through the text. You know, no more shall it be that an infant lives but a few days, but even 100 years will be young to die. And this whole kind of set of contrasts that in that space must have brought, I guess, enormous hope, but also when something is so unequal, something is so uneven as what their life was like post-exile and through the exile, to then this vision of, you know, utopia almost, that hope then becomes a challenge, doesn't it? It's a real leap of faith to go from that to the contrast that is being spoken about here.
Yeah, so most of the time people do connect this one with the creation, going back to the original creative order, where everything had a kind of, harmony between each other, God and human being, and a human being with animals. So it's, envisioning the same kind of creative order back, and where God is in the midst of people, and there is no barrier even between God and human being, no barrier between human being and animals, and that kind of a vision. So it's a harmony, among peaceful harmony, no exploitation, no pain, because there is nothing stops each other to come together. No. So that kind of picture. So one way we could connect with that. The other aspect is, then immediately we think that we don't have a responsibility, it's God is in control, to bring back. But I think what Isaiah is trying to say, we need to bring that original creation back, but we have a responsibility.
Yeah.
So Isaiah in other passages like chapter 40, where it says, every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain shall make low. So that means there are lows and highs in the hierarchical system, that whoever is on high needs to bring, brought low. So that means there are people needs to work hard to come down from their level, whereas the people, those who are already in the low, had to be lifted up in some way. So that needs to be, some work needs to be done in which each one have a responsibility towards bring that harmony.
Yeah.
Whether in the marginalized, side or the oppressor side, each one has a responsibility. So it is a call for everyone, so that it can be more peaceful. Because most of the time when we talk about either liberation theology or anything on justice, we always focus on the oppressed kind of side. So of course I will speak for them, I will be with them, and I can speak, God is on their side. But when we talk about harmony, and when we talk about peaceful existence, coexistence with everyone, then everyone has a responsibility towards bringing that peace.
Yeah.
And that's what Isaiah is talking here.
Which is incredibly powerful when we put the lens of Remembrance Sunday through this passage of, and I think that's really important, that we don't just kind of chop the past off and this is new, which you could do in this past, this is new, this is old, but actually it's about how we all come together. We all have that responsibility and those scales of kind of justice within us, and it's balancing our own kind of scales of right and wrong to bring our harmony to it, and the responsibility and the difference of the journey of harmony for each individual it would be. But then what that creates, one hopes, is a world where war isn't possible. And that is really beautiful thought when we are sat where we are with the war in Ukraine, looking at Remembrance Sunday this week. It's a really powerful image, isn't it?
Yes. I think thinking about Remembrance Sunday coming from, originally coming from Indian context, though lived in this country for the last 23 years. But still I have a kind of, different opinion and, views on how we remember Remembrance Sunday in that sense. So for me is at least, by remembering all those who gave their life. So of course we are supporting the families whose dear ones lost their lives in the war in order to save so many, the future of the next generation. While we remember that, there is other things to be considered as well. So when we remember, just to say that it should not happen again. So in current context, we are still experiencing war in different nations, and Ukraine is the good example. What are we, by remembering this, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Our action in response to Ukraine war. So it's good that we remember and we support the families, and we pay that, tribute to all those who have lost their life. But by doing that, we need to make sure that it does not happen again. But by responding to the current situation where the war is still, alive, and the people are, affected by war and discrimination. But the other thing is, because the war, when we think about war, it's more about thinking about either justice or peace. So when we talk about peace, peaceful kingdom, and we should make sure that there should be no more war, and we should be aiming for just society. So this all linked together. It's not just having one Sunday every year to remember all those who have died, but it should be our action plan that we should work towards justice, and we should make sure that there should not be any war in the world around, and not necessarily in our country where immediate context, because whatever we do in one part of the country does affect another part of the country, directly or indirectly, so which we don't realize. Sometimes we withdraw ourselves from some of the things that's happening around the world. So I think we need to make sure that it is a justice related issue, and if we are working towards peaceful kingdom, all these things matter. And
to remember that often war is the result of that injustice, and it's how we deal with that before it escalates. And I think, if I may bring in the Luke passage, when I kind of read the Luke passage, it really made my heart sore, because it is this sense of almost feeling like a bit where we're at now, this sense of building back better, all these political slogans of being better than it was before. And that's exactly where we're at in the Luke passage, is here is this temple, the temple that was built after exile that wasn't very good has now been, razed to the ground, because Herod's temple is going to be the best temple, the biggest temple, the most adorned with jewels temple. And therefore, the center of their world is something that is built almost out, it is built out of ego, and how easy it is to sit and admire that, as the disciples were, and Jesus's lesson of that's just the pretty picture, it's not the thing.
You are right in saying that the temple, the originally built, being extended by Herod to make it kind of even twice bigger the original temple Solomon built. So the disciples were just admiring of the beauty of the gloriousness of the temple. But immediately we can see the reaction of Jesus saying that, don't worry about that, it's going to kind of, go away. But that's, I think one way we see that from the point of view of disciples and the people lived in Jesus's context would see as something what they consider as an important place to worship God is going to be destroyed. So it's that side of looking at temple is different from what I would see in the light of Isaiah's passage. So if we are expecting the whole community, the whole world to be together, is Jerusalem temple is the only, because what I see Jerusalem temple is holding power and authority because it was under the control of Roman at the time. And the way Herod started to rebuild, extend the temple, is to show his power and his authority over the temple. And the way Jerusalem temple was constructed is the layer after layer where the people are, put in different categories. So not everyone can enter into main place. So it's more, restricted in that sense. It's immediately you can connect this one with the conversation Jesus having with the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
Where immediately, Samaritan woman says, oh yes, our people, our ancestors worship in this mountain, but Jewish people always say that you can worship only in Jerusalem. Then Jesus immediately reacts saying that, there will be a time when either this mountain or that mountain will exist, but people will worship in truth and in spirit and truth. So the point Jesus is trying to make here, if I'm not right, from my perspective, is, having the disruption is not a main issue for Jesus. It's more about disciples to understand the worship space is everywhere. It's not God is not limited to one particular building.
Yeah.
And the people should be able to worship wherever they are. So it's broaden up the destruction of the temple. It might be a bad aspect, bad news for Jewish people at that time, and even now. But thinking about those, being a woman outside of that category, outside of that Jewish community, when I feel part of the Jewish, Jesus's the peaceful kingdom, if I wanted to be part of. And I don't want to restrict God in one particular place.
No.
And the more about it's not only the place that Jesus is worried about, but how the temple was controlled, the power is shown, and this discrimination was. So when he got angry on temple in John chapter 2, where he overthrows all because of the exploitation that was happening in the temple court. So all those things will see that, it's against that Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. So all the discrimination that's happening in the name of the temple, all the dominion and power that's happening in the name of the temple, all been destroyed. So that means it's not the worship space that Jesus is talking about, but what is happening in the temple will be destroyed. So that everyone will have a freedom to worship without any discrimination, without, peace will be established when you worship the Lord.
And there's some really, you're absolutely right, but there's some really terrifying echoes, isn't there, in this, when you hear of wars and insurrections. We probably wouldn't have necessarily used insurrection in our language until January the 6th, and we see these things, and you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and you look at the divisions of things like Rwanda, where that sense of someone going against somebody was something that really kind of came out of the war, and thinking how easily that's done. But then again, you look at America now and how divisive the kind of MAGA community is, and the fighting against that, and the kind of the sense that Donald Trump is this messiah that speaks the real language of people, is really terrifying. That we're actually, this is here, this is humans, and it's laid bare in this passage in Luke.
Yeah, I think it is terrifying by reading that, these things will happen, and when you encounter those things, some of the things are happening around us, and we feel that, what's going on. And I think for me, what Jesus is trying to say here is more about, so these things may happen, but don't be afraid.
Yeah.
I think the assurance of hope that I see, God's presence even in the midst of all those things.
Yeah.
It's the message I get out of this passage, rather than, because already we are encountering. So sometimes when we read carefully the text and we worry too much about that particular verse, without realizing there are even worse things happening in our context where we live in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if we are part of that oppressed community, then the reaction will be different. Yeah. But if you are in the dominant, there is a kind of something needs to be learned from and challenged by reading this passage. Yeah. But maybe, coming from my own context, and what I see is, something, okay, God, I am going through all these things, but I don't have to be worried, but not to be quiet, but realizing that the God is with us in that kind of situation. That's a kind of typical liberation theologian's point of view. God is in the midst of struggle, those who are suffering, that kind of feel. But the only worry for me is some of these passages are taken as something, it's eschatological kind of events that's going to happen, and we don't have to worry about it, because sometimes we see our faith as a private and a personal one, nothing to do with the public life. But I think when we connect all these things in our day-to-day life and how we react and what's our responsibility, it's important to realize it's not something eschatological that Jesus is talking about. No. It happened immediately after. So it's a real life situation that Jesus is tackling. Yeah. And we need to be careful about that, how we connect.
And suddenly we circle right back to the end of Isaiah, where it is each our responsibility to find our even ground, and the world in which that would create if we could manage to do that as a human race.
Yeah.
Jasmine, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and reflections today. Thank you to the rest of you for joining us to ask whether or how we should preach politics in the pulpit this week. If you have enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. We love having an ongoing conversation with our listeners about faith and politics, so do join in on Twitter at @pulpit_politics or using the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. Or you can join us on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page and on their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. So the question, the thought, the thing that we leave you with for this week: where are you on your path to evenness? Are you up on the mountain? Are you down in the valley, where each is our own responsibility as human beings? Let us know your thoughts about that on Twitter or on Facebook. So let's go into both our politics and our pulpits with this blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.